Most people eating bread every morning have no idea what is actually in it. So, we looked. Florida's Department of Health pulled 8 bread products off grocery store shelves this year and sent them to an independent lab. 6 came back positive for glyphosate, the active chemical in Roundup. That is on top of a separate, larger nationwide study from a few years earlier that found some organic, non-GMO labeled loaves testing higher than the cheap store brand sitting right next to them on the same shelf. Nobody plans for that. You buy the loaf with the seal? Because the seal is supposed to mean something, because you assumed paying more at the register meant walking away with less of whatever it is you were actually trying to avoid in the first place. This is not a story about a hidden plot or a secret agenda buried in your bread. It is a story about ordinary farming practices, ordinary corporate ownership structures, and ordinary gaps in what labeling law actually requires, all quietly stacking up in the same grocery aisle you walk through every week without thinking twice about it. We are counting down 8 brands worth rethinking, based on real independent lab testing, not guesswork. And we are ending with 3 brands that actually test clean and back that up with real ongoing certification instead of a logo and a promise. Let's get into it. Number 8, great value whole wheat. This is Walmart's house bread. Cheap, familiar, always in stock. The one that ends up in the cart because it is easy, not because anyone thought hard about it. Independent lab testing commissioned by researchers working with the Detox Project found 340 parts per billion of glyphosate in Great Value's 100% whole wheat bread. For comparison, the Environmental Working Group considers anything above 160 parts per billion worth paying attention to, based on their own health benchmark, which is far more conservative than the government's legal limit. Regulators will point out that the legal ceiling for glyphosate on wheat is 30,000 parts per billion, so this result is nowhere close to breaking any law. But that ceiling was calculated using worst-case exposure math for one chemical in one food, eaten by one healthy adult in isolation. It was never built to account for someone eating bread, crackers, oatmeal, and cereal made from the same treated grain supply across the same day. Exposure adds up in a way the regulation does not. Walmart pulls in hundreds of billions of dollars in revenue every year. Sourcing cleaner wheat is not a budget problem at that scale. It is a choice about where the savings in the price tag actually come from. Number 7. Market Pantry Target's in-house bread brand tested at 348 parts per billion of glyphosate in that same round of independent testing, just slightly higher than Walmart's loaf, sitting one aisle over in a different store. Here is the part that actually explains the number, instead of just alarming you with it. Most glyphosate in wheat does not come from someone spraying it directly onto your finished loaf. Farmers apply it before harvest as a desiccant, spraying the standing crop to dry it out evenly so the entire field can be cut on the same day instead of ripening unevenly and forcing multiple harvest passes. That spray gets absorbed into the still-living kernel days before it is cut, which is exactly why the residue shows up later in the flour and then in the bread on your counter. It is a legal, common, decades-old farming practice, not a hidden scheme by any single company. It is also why store brand and name brand bread made from conventionally grown wheat tend to land in a similar range no matter which grocery chain happens to be selling it that week. Number 6. Sara Lee. Sara Lee's 100% whole wheat sandwich bread tested at 284 parts per billion in that same independent study. Then, in February of 2026, Florida's Department of Health separately tested Sara Lee's honey wheat and got the highest single reading of their entire state testing round, 191 parts per billion. 2 different Sara Lee loaves, 2 different testing rounds, 2 different labs, and both land near the top of their respective lists. Sara Lee is owned by Bimbo Bakeries USA, the same parent company that owns Arnold, Orowait, Thomas's, and Entenmann's. One corporation, several shelf brands that look like independent competitors standing next to each other in the bread aisle, but that actually draw from the same industrial grain supply chain behind the scenes. It is also worth reading the label a little closer. Honey shows up right there in the product name, but corn syrup shows up in the ingredient list underneath it. That is not illegal, and it is not unusual for the industry. It is just marketing doing more work on the front of the bag than the actual ingredient panel backs up on the back. Number 5. Nature's Own Flowers Foods is one of the largest bread companies in the country, and Nature's Own is their flagship, built on words like natural and wholesome, printed across a bag that looks intentionally simple. In that same February 2026 Florida testing round, Nature's Own butter bread came back at 190 parts per billion. Their perfectly crafted white tested at 132. Read past the glyphosate number and you will find calcium propionate on the ingredient list, a mold inhibitor used to extend shelf life. A peer-reviewed, double-blind, placebo-controlled study published in the Journal of Pediatrics and Child Health found that some children showed measurably worse irritability, restlessness, and sleep disturbance after eating bread containing that preservative compared to an identical-looking placebo loaf. That is not a fringe claim. It is published research, and it is part of why a major fast food chain publicly dropped that exact preservative from its hamburger buns a few years back, citing the same behavioral concerns. Calcium propionate is not banned in the United States, and most people eating it will never notice a thing. But it is an ingredient with documented downsides for at least some kids, sitting quietly in a product marketed specifically around the word wholesome. Number 4. Wonder Bread. Wonder Bread does not try to be organic, and it does not pretend to be a health food. It sells nostalgia, the loaf your grandmother trusted, the one that belongs on every kitchen counter in America according to decades of advertising. Florida's testing found 173 parts per billion of glyphosate in Wonder Bread Classic White. It is also owned by Flowers Foods, the same company, running through the same supply chain as Nature's Own. Look further down the ingredient label and you will find calcium sulfate, which happens to be the exact same compound used to manufacture construction drywall. That sounds alarming on its own until you understand it is also a long-approved food additive used in bread as a dough conditioner and a source of calcium, at a completely different purity and concentration than the industrial version used in your walls. Both facts are true at the same time. It is legal, it is common across the entire industry, and it is also not what most people picture in their heads when they imagine a wholesome, old-fashioned loaf of white bread. Number 3. Pepperidge Farm. Pepperidge Farm is owned by the Campbell's Company, and it is the bread people reach for specifically because it feels like a step above everything else sitting on the same shelf. Independent lab testing found 587 parts per billion of glyphosate in Pepperidge Farm's 100% whole grain whole wheat bread. Their Jewish rye and pumpernickel deli swirl came back even higher, at 531 parts per billion. Here is the honest caveat that matters here. Pepperidge Farm is not uniform across its entire lineup, and painting the whole brand with one number would not be accurate. Their Farmhouse Hearty White Loaf tested with no detectable glyphosate at all in Florida's 2026 testing round. The same year, the whole wheat variety scored near the top of the independent study. Same company, same shelf, wildly different result depending on the specific loaf you actually pick up, which tells you the grain sourcing behind each product line varies more than the shared packaging design would ever suggest. Number 2. Dave's Killer Bread. This is the brand health-conscious shoppers reach for with real, earned confidence. Organic certified, non-GMO verified, a founder's redemption story printed right across the front of the bag. In Florida's 2026 testing, Dave's Killer Bread's White Done Right came back at just under 12 parts per billion, and their 21 whole grains loaf tested at just over 10. Those numbers are genuinely low, meaningfully lower than every conventional brand on this entire list, and they deserve credit for that. But low is not the same thing as zero, and a brand built almost entirely around being the clean, honest, organic option made a very specific promise to the people paying a premium for it. There is a separate issue sitting alongside the lab results too. In September of 2024, a federal court in California certified a class action lawsuit against Dave's Killer Bread and its parent company Flowers Foods over protein claims printed on the front of several packages that did not include the required percent daily value disclosure the FDA mandates for that kind of statement. The case argued that the front label overstated how much usable, digestible protein was actually in each slice. That lawsuit moved toward a settlement in early 2026. The bread itself tested clean by comparison to everything else on this list. The label made a promise the company has had to work through in federal court, which is a very different kind of problem than the glyphosate numbers we have covered so far. But it belongs in the same conversation about whether the story printed on a bag actually matches what is inside it. Number 1, 365 by Whole Foods. Amazon owns Whole Foods, and Whole Foods spent years building its entire identity around ingredients it refuses to sell at all, banning things like bromated flour and artificial dyes long before most competitors even considered it. Independent lab testing found 1,040 parts per billion of glyphosate in 365 whole wheat sandwich bread, the highest confirmed number of any nationally distributed branded bread in that entire round of testing. For scale, that result is still below the legal ceiling, but it sits at roughly 6.5 times the level the Environmental Working Group flags as worth real attention. This is the grocery store people choose specifically because they trust the standard sitting behind the label, the one that costs more precisely because of that trust. The test result simply does not match the reputation the store spent years building, and there is no law anywhere that requires Whole Foods or any grocery chain to disclose a gap like that on the shelf tag next to the price. Why this chemical keeps showing up. Before we get to what actually works, it helps to understand why glyphosate is sitting in so many of these loaves in the first place. Because the answer is not a mystery. Bayer, which bought Roundup's original manufacturer Monsanto back in 2018, has already paid out roughly $11 billion to settle close to 100,000 lawsuits from people who developed non-Hodgkin lymphoma after regular exposure to the herbicide. In February of 2026, the company proposed an additional settlement worth up to $7.25 billion, structured as payments stretched across the next 21 years, aimed at resolving both current and future claims in one long-term deal. Bayer continues to publicly deny that glyphosate causes cancer, and it is worth saying plainly here that a large legal settlement is not automatically the same thing as a scientific conclusion. Companies often settle to end costly, unpredictable litigation, regardless of who was actually right. But the scale of that number tells you glyphosate is not some obscure, rarely used chemical. It is one of the most widely applied herbicides in American agriculture, sprayed across wheat, oats, barley, lentils, and dozens of other staple crops, which is exactly why it keeps turning up in products that have nothing to do with lawns or gardens. If this has already started changing how you look at your own bread aisle, you are not stuck with just a list of things to avoid. Here is what to actually put in the cart instead. Best option number 3, Food for Life, Ezekiel. Bread. Start with something most people genuinely do not expect. There is no flour at all in Ezekiel bread. Food for Life sprouts 6 organic whole grains and legumes together, including wheat, barley, millet, lentils, soybeans, and spelt. Then bakes the sprouted mixture slowly at a controlled temperature, specifically to preserve the nutritional density that gets lost in a typical industrial baking process. The product carries biochecked non-glyphosate certification, which means the finished baked loaf itself is regularly lab-tested and comes back with no detectable residue, not just a company promise that nothing was sprayed on purpose somewhere upstream. The texture is dense and noticeably chewy, quite unlike the soft, springy bread sitting higher up on the avoid list. And most people find it genuinely works best toasted rather than eaten straight from the bag. Best option number 2, 1 Degree, Organics. 1 Degree does something almost no other bread brand in the country bothers to do. They publish the actual farm source for their ingredients, and you can scan a code printed right on the bag to trace the wheat back toward the specific region where it was actually grown, instead of just trusting a generic organic label. Like Food for Life, 1 Degree carries that same biochecked non-glyphosate certification, with finished products tested multiple times a year by an independent, accredited laboratory, rather than once at launch and never again. Distribution is still more limited than the big national grocery brands, so you may need a natural grocery store nearby or a direct online order to actually find it. But it is one of the few brands on the entire market genuinely proving what it claims with ongoing lab data, instead of simply printing a claim on the packaging and hoping nobody checks. Best option number 1, Silver Hills Sprouted Bakery. If the density of Ezekiel bread feels like more of a texture adjustment than you are ready to make, Silver Hills is the most practical, clean option on this entire list. It is a Canadian, family-owned company, and its full lineup carries that same biochecked, non-glyphosate certification, with residues consistently testing below the laboratory's detection limit across repeated rounds of independent testing. The texture is hearty, but still soft enough to work for an everyday sandwich straight out of the bag, which makes it genuinely the easiest brand on this list to actually switch to without changing how your family eats breakfast and lunch. The one rule, worth keeping. Before you go, here is the simple version of everything above, one that does not require memorizing a single lab result or a single parts per billion number. Flip the bag over in the store and count the ingredients. Real bread is flour, water, salt, yeast, and maybe a small amount of oil, 5 ingredients or fewer, the same basic formula bread has used for centuries. Everything past that short list was typically added to extend shelf life, hold in moisture, or cut down on ingredient cost, not to make the bread meaningfully better for the person eating it. And when you do see a USDA organic seal on a bag, it helps to actually know what that seal verifies and what it quietly does not. It confirms the grower did not intentionally apply glyphosate to that specific crop. It does not confirm that no glyphosate ever arrived through drift from a neighboring conventional field. And right now, no law requires anyone to disclose that gap on the label. If you want actual proof instead of a well-meaning promise, look specifically for biochecked, non-glyphosate certified or non-GMO project verified, since both of those require real, ongoing lab testing of the finished product sitting on the shelf, not just a certification based on farming practices upstream. None of this means the bread you have been eating your whole life is dangerous in the way a warning label on a bottle of poison is dangerous. The numbers we walked through today are almost all well below the government's legal ceiling, and that ceiling exists because regulators genuinely reviewed the science, even if reasonable people can disagree about whether that ceiling should be lower. What this list actually gives you is something more useful than fear. It gives you a way to tell the difference between a brand that is quietly cutting corners on sourcing and a brand that is actually earning the price difference it is charging you at checkout. If this changed how you think about what is sitting in your bread drawer right now, hit like. Subscribe if you want more breakdowns like this one, and drop a comment with whichever brand on this list surprised you the most. I genuinely read every single one, and your comment might end up being the next brand we send to the lab.